Tara na sa kwentuhang malaya kang pakikinggan. Ako si Addie mula sa Liberal Youth at ito ang The Freedom Show. Magandang araw sa ating lahat. Welcome to the first episode of Freedom Show by Liberal Youth. At sa first episode natin ngayon, kasama natin ang Associate Professor in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies and Faculty Chair of the Center for Southeast Asia Studies, CSEAS of UC Berkeley, a historian, writer, and one of the leading liberal thinkers of our new generation, a graduate of Ateneo de Manila University and the University of Melbourne, Professor Lisandro Claudio. So welcome po, Prof. Leloy.
Hello, Addie. Kamusta? Magandang umaga sa'yo.
Magandang umaga po, sir. Magandang araw po. So for our discussion, maybe we could start with the history of Philippine liberalism. So, Prof. Leloy, how should we understand Philippine liberalism historically? And do you think it is time for us to move forward to a fifth phase of liberalism?
Ako, nabigla ako kasi binanggit yung article ko where I said there were 4 phases to Philippine liberalism. Kailangan ko ata ng shortcut dahil hindi ko siguradong naalala ko yung 4 phases ko. But yung first phase definitely doon, for sure, is yung beginnings ng Philippine nationalism, which is also the beginnings of Philippine liberalism. So my contention is that the Philippine nationalism is by default a liberal nationalism. Kasi sino ba ang ama ng ating nationalismo? Si Jose Rizal. At bakit si Jose Rizal naniwala na dapat maging independent ang Philippines from Spain? It's because Spain could no longer give us or did not want to give us certain liberal freedoms like freedom to organize, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. At nung napagtanto ni Rizal na yung mga freedoms na yon ay hindi maibibigay ng Espanya sa Pilipinas, nagpasya siya na dapat ihiwalay na yung Pilipinas from Spain. And that is the birth of Philippine liberalism, really, which you see in the founding documents of the kind of Rizalian canon, from Noli Me Tangere to El Filibusterismo, but also even to like the Charter of La Liga Filipina. Nandyan yan lahat yung mga prinsipyo na yan.
Thank you very much po, sir. Then do you think, since nga right now, based from that article, parang we are still in the fourth phase of liberalism, which is intermittent anti-dictatorship. So do you think,
Kung
what's the future of the Philippines?
Salamat at na refresh nyo yung memory ko doon sa sinulat ko. Kasi matagal na ako actually din nagsusulat tungkol sa kasaysayan ng liberalismo. I think in that article I said there was the final phase of liberalism, or the phase we were in when I wrote that, was intermittent anti-dictatorship. Begins with the Marcos period, merong dictator, so magkakaroon ng democratization, so magkakaroon ng dictator ulit. And during these periods, na-purify yung liberalism because I think liberals clearly see what they are fighting for when what they are fighting for is being taken away from them by an authoritarian leader. And sinabi ko intermittent kasi minsan may diktador, minsan wala. Of course, yung 2 dictators that I'm talking about are Ferdinand Marcos, and then our first ever bona fide criminal against humanity, ang mamamatay tao, ang mass murderer na si Rodrigo Duterte, who wasn't just a dictator but who was also a mass murderer and criminal, not just against the Philippines but against against the notion of what it means to be a human being. That's what a criminal against humanity is. Now, whether or not we're still in that phase, hindi natin alam, but definitely kung bumalik sa kapangyarihan ng mga Duterte, masasabi nating nando pa rin tayo sa phase natin of intermittent anti-dictatorship movements.
Thank you very much po, sir. So it really depends on the future electoral victories of the opposition, I guess.
Yes, at saka sa akin talaga, it really depends on mapupuksa na ba talaga itong pagkademonyo ng pamilya Duterte na isang pamilya ng mga mamamatay tao na kontra Pilipino.
Thank you very much po, sir, with that. So maybe with the next discussion naman po, we could proceed dun sa parang second phase naman po, which is yung, third phase rather, which is state building. So maybe you can expound to us the post-war or state building phase of Philippine liberalism and the Philippine state, and what aspects of this historical era are often overlooked, especially in terms of economic transformation, the Great Debate, etc.
Well, so 1946, of course, we took over the reins of governance. Of course, the Filipino nation had been around for a very long time, at least in the 19th century. Some people might say earlier, but the idea of the existence of a Filipino-led government, that only came about in 1946 when independence was transferred to the Philippines. And because of that, Filipinos, in particular Filipino liberals, were able to command the towering heights of Filipino politics and economics. So from 1946 onwards, sabi mo man nationalista yan or liberal party yan, most of the politicians during this period believed in a kind of basic core liberal principles of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, etc., etc. And they also, most of these politicians also shunned extremes. The extreme, for example, of communism at that time, of course, during the post-war period, malakas ang komunismo hindi lang sa Pilipinas, kundi globally because this was the Cold War. But I think a lot of them also shunned the extreme of unfettered free market capitalism during this period. So a kind of real liberal centrist position that emerged. So, ang sinabi ko dun sa article na yun, lahat ng mga successes nung period na yun, you can attribute it to liberals. But also a lot of the failures, you can attribute it to liberals also. So for example, I think that one of the great successes of that period, of course, was that we were able to build a functional state after a war. And we forget that the Philippines was really in a mess after World War II. Manila was the most destroyed city after Warsaw, and we had a severe balance of payments crisis. So the fact that we were able to build institutions and that these institutions were democratic is to the credit, I think, of liberals. Pero of course, marami rin mga problema ng panahon na yun. For example, yung war against the hooks na maraming mga excesses na naging eventually human rights violations, right? Kasalanan din yun ng mga liberals. And of course, I think in the 1950s, doon talaga nagsimula yung ating tendency to be a really austere post-colonial state where the government refused to spend on social services. And I think that was the fault of liberals also. So, this period to state building, the successes and the faults are inaako yan ng mga liberal. And by that, I'm not just saying the Liberal Party. Kasi even the bureaucrats of that time who didn't belong to any party, for example, they were liberal in orientation, I would say.
Thank you very much po, sir. Siguro, follow-up question, ano po siguro yung parallels between the failures before the failures we have right now?
Ngayon, so nung panahon na yun, ang demonyo for me of the 1950s, the worst character of that period were two people. Unang-una si Central Bank Governor Miguel Cuaderno who really starved the economy because he wished to preserve the 2:1 peso. Now, to preserve an expensive currency, you have to restrict spending kasi gusto mo mahal yung currency mo. So, if you spend a lot, dadaming pera, hihina yung currency. And effectively, he did that because he said he wanted to tamp down on inflation. Pero actually, during the 1950s, there was negative inflation. There was deflation, which I can explain is actually worse for the economy than an inflation. And ang resulta nun is, of course, yung employment natin hindi umakyat. Yung underemployment natin got worse. And then, of course, nagkaroon ka ng labor problems during the 1950s as a result of that. The other effect of that, of course, was that we did not build up a strong export-oriented industrial society that would have allowed us to become stronger in the 1960s and 1970s. So in the 1950s, dito talaga tayo nagsimulang mapag-iwanan ng ating mga neighbors. Like, for example, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. It's in the 1950s, 1960s na nagkaroon talaga ng problema yung bansa natin. And I don't want to demonize just one person, but there's really one person who did the most damage, and I think that's Central Bank Governor Cuaderno. The second person who did a lot of damage then was Carlos P. Garcia, who supported the policies of the central bank during this time. We think Carlos P. Garcia was an economic nationalist because of the Filipino First policy, pero that's just propaganda. What the Filipino First policy was actually called before he rebranded it as Filipino First, he called it the austerity policy. Now, as you can imagine, austerity is not very popular because you're saying, austerity, hindi tayo gagasa, gugutumin namin kayo. That's not very popular. So, ang ginawa niya, pinilitan niya, ginawa niyang Filipino First. But really, this guy was one of the worst presidents we've ever had in terms of economics. I'm not even sure if he's from the Liberal Party or the Nationalista Party. Nakalimutan ko na.
Nationalista po,
Nung
sir.
si Garcia. Ha?
Nationalista po yata siya, sir.
Nationalista, yeah. Oh, so buti na lang nationalista. But Garcia and Cuaderno did a lot of damage in the 1950s.
Yes po, sir. Then what, ano po kaya yung parallel niya
Ay,
sa
oo nga
current
pala. Oo nga
natin?
pala. Yes, he was
Yes
a
po.
nationalista. And here's a funny fact. His main critic at that time was a young liberal congressman by the name of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. Nakakatawa, di ba? Pero liberal pa si FM nung time na yun.
Then sir, ano po kaya yung parang parallel niya sa current um, natin ngayon na economic policy?
Well, yung parallel ngayon is in many ways, we still think like the founder of the central bank. We think of the economy as a kind of household when it's actually not a household. So a household, for example, you have to be austere para ka dapat nanay na binibilang mo bawat peso kasi kung hindi mo binilang, magkakaroon ka ng utang. At ang pinakaayaw mo bilang nanay ay utang, lalo na kung hindi mo ito mababayaran. Hanggang ngayon, ganun pa rin tayo mag-isip. We think that every peso we spend has to be accounted for through utang. And we think that if we create a deficit, that's bad for us. Now, deficits are not the worst thing in the world because if the government didn't spend a deficit, di walang papasok na pera sa private sector because every time the government spends a deficit, that's money for the private sector and that's money that creates growth, of course. So if you actually zeroed out deficits, and deficit is really just maraming ginagasta yung gobyerno. If you zeroed out deficits, walang pera para sa private sector. Ganun lang kasimple yun. If you zeroed out deficits, walang perang umiikot at kung walang perang umiikot, magkakaroon ka ng recession slash deflation and it would be really bad for the economy. It's the fact that we still think that the economy is like a household. Ito nakuha natin from that generation, from the generation of Cuaderno.
Thank you, sir. And also siguro yung highlight ko rin yung kanina na naging critic ni Carlos P. Garcia is si Marcos. Then nabanggit niyo rin po sa isa yung book is that si Marcos yung parang implement pa ng export-led industrialization. Pero it turned out na hindi naging sustainable because
Yeah, I think
yes.
one of my favorite liberals, he was not necessarily a member of the Liberal Party, but I think he was a true liberal in the kind of center-left liberal tradition, was Salvador Araneta, si Don Badong. And it was very interesting because I think Don Badong was the guy who could be the fairest to Marcos. Imagine this, Don Badong opposed the martial law constitution. And because of that, actually, interesting story, one of the people who was pushing the martial law constitution was Miguel Cuaderno. So he was already a bad economist, pro-dictatorship pa siya. The guy was really terrible. So anyway, kalaban siya ni Don Badong sa economics, kalaban rin siya ni Don Badong sa politics. And after yung away na yun ng politika because he did not support the martial law constitution, the 73 constitution, what would become eventually, I think, the 73 constitution. I'm a historian, but I'm very bad with dates. I think it's the 73 constitution. Don Badong was exiled. He ended up here in the Bay Area and then he moved eventually to Vancouver, Canada. But in the depths of his exile, he said, there are certain economic policies Marcos is doing that are correct, including, for example, depreciating the peso and investing in exports. But he made one important proviso, sabi ni Don Badong, but none of this justifies him being a dictator. Um, which is very interesting because that statement allows us to disentangle the economics from the politics, and it allows us to be slightly fair to the generation of economists who actually thought about building exports for the Philippines. Exports are so important because exports are what provide us, for example, with foreign currency, right? And foreign currency can really insulate you from shocks. But also exports, especially if they're manufacturing-based exports, are the kinds of products that create good and sustainable jobs back home, right? Now there was there was an impulse to do that on the part of the Marcos government, but because of many reasons, from, for example, financial crisis, corruption, mismanagement, lahat na, isama mo na lahat, bagyo, gumuho yung programa na yun.
Thank you, sir. Then siguro let's move to another topic. After Marcos na tayo siguro, sir. So why do you
Mhm.
think the post-ed sa Philippine liberal forces or liberals in general missed a crucial opportunity to push for deeper economic transformation such as industrialization? Bakit parang di natin natuloy yung industrial policy sana na nag-start
Yeah, we
before?
threw the baby out with the bathwater. Kasi for example, we associated expansive fiscal and monetary policy with Marcos. And because it's associated with Marcos, ayaw natin kasi anti-Marcos tayo. We associate, for example, a developmental central bank with Marcos, and because of that, ayaw na natin to. So, for example, the new central bank law that we have now, it says that that central bank cannot do anything developmental. It only has one mandate. Its sole mandate is anti-inflation. Now, this is the first time in our history since the 1950s that we've had a central bank na isa lang ang mandato. Kasi usually ang central bank, dalawa ang mandato, even in the history of the Philippines. One is anti-inflation, the other one is development, right? If you look at the Fed, for example, which is the central bank of the United States, it has a dual mandate, and many other central banks in the world have dual mandate. What does it mean when we say na isa lang yung mandato ng central bank natin? When we look at a central bank like that, a single mandate central bank, what that means is, kasi hoda sa central bank natin kung mag-slow down ang economic growth, kasi hindi man siya developmental, di ba? For as long as you have stable inflation, right? And that's a trade-off that we've really felt, right? Because you may have low inflation, but if you don't have growth, there aren't going to be jobs, right? And actually, inflation is not the worst thing in the world, because inflation just means there's more money. Inflation means there's more money in the system. Inflation in the history of the Philippines means that because there's more money in the system, sometimes people get more jobs, right? If you go to a richer country than us, mas mahal ang bilihin doon because in a richer country, employees demand more, because they have better jobs, and because they have better jobs, they're able to spend more, and that creates inflation. I'm not saying that inflation is good all the time, but what I'm saying is that there should be a reasonable defense of reasonable inflation, and our central bank doesn't think that way.
Thank you, sir. Siguro curious din po kami, before po ba, like, panahon ng post-war, gano'n na rin yung parang approach sa inflation, nung panahon siguro ni Quirino and Macapagal, we also may nakita rin po kaming mga projects nila that are pro-industrialization to a sense. For example, yung Mariveles Shipyard, Maria Cristina Dam, Pacnotat Cement
Yeah.
Plant, parang more on production, yung kanilang relation. So, um, parang may ganun ng initiatives before. So, would that be
Yeah,
good?
yeah. I mean, sabi nga ni Professor Jesus Felipe, for most of the politicians before the Marcos period, there was an agreement that you needed to industrialize because at that time there was really no other way naman to get rich apart from industrialization, right? Ito namang services sector, recently lang natin na-discover yan. This is a kind of blip in our history na we went all in on services. And now it's becoming clear that that bet is not paying off, right? Because something like I think at least 36% of jobs in the Philippines are threatened by AI because we overinvested so much in the services sector. Hindi naman ganun mag-isip ang mga Pilipino nung panahon nung earlier in our history. Um, but it wasn't just these guys. The kind of industrial impulse of Filipino politicians begins really with people like Quezon and Osmeña, right? That's why meron akong konting tampo dun sa Quezon film because they make it seem as if Quezon was just a kind of conniving politician, but he was also a kind of industrializing president who believed that he could harness the power of Filipino people. And that's what I think industrial policy is, Adi. It's really just harnessing the untapped powers of the Filipino people.
Thank you very much po, sir, for that description din of industrial policy. So next po siguro would be how can liberalism, or maybe specifically the liberal democratic opposition, can speak more convincingly to issues of inequality, job creation, and economic precarity, and how can we make it more attractive to the youth din po?
Yeah. So how do you bind the question that I've been thinking about for at least 10 years now is how do you bind people to liberal institutions? Nagsimula talaga ito nung panahon ni Duterte, 'di ba? Because it was very clear to me at that time that Filipinos no longer felt attached to the liberal institutions. Wala silang pakialam sa liberal state. And by liberal institutions, I don't just mean like the Liberal Party. I mean like even like discursive institutions like human rights. Parang wala silang pake. Wala silang pake dun sa estado na pangangalagaan yung karapatang pantao ng ibang Pilipino. Gusto lang nila patayin na yung mga kalaban nila. That was a very sad period in my life when I was looking at Filipinos and I thought they really don't care about the liberal state, and it was very clear from the surveys. The way yung napagtanto ko, the way you bind people to the liberal state is you make sure that the liberal state provides them services. Paano manunumbalik ang tiwala ng mga Pilipino sa gobyerno? Well, kung yung gobyerno yung pinapakain sila, binibihisan sila, binibigyan sila ng trabaho, pinapag-aral sila, 'di ba? Ginagamot sila, then they become closer to that state. That is why social democracies are the most stable liberal democracies in the world because these social democracies make sure that nobody falls through the cracks, right? And that's why I've always thought, just in terms of Philippine politics, right? Close yung partido ko, yung akbayan sa partido nyo, yung Liberal Youth. Bakit tayo close, Liberal Party, bakit tayo close? Because there's no liberalism without social democracy. That's what I've always thought, right?
Thank you, sir. Then, siguro ano yung going back to yung definition natin ng industrial policy kanina na untapped potential of the Filipino. Siguro, maybe we can expound on that, sir. Like, ano po siguro yung untapped potential na yun na kailangan nating mas palitawin?
So, industrial policy is the government stepping in to tap the economic potential of a country. So, some people have called that neo-mercantilism, some people have called that developmentalism, and others have just called it industrial policy. Um, and this goes against, of course, yung tendency ng maraming economists who believe that the primary role of the state should be a kind of fair market regulator instead of a market participant. Right? So if you believe in industrial policy, naniniwala ka na nagtataya talaga dapat ang gobyerno sa ekonomiya para palakasin yung ekonomi na yun. And it involves actually selecting certain industries that the government will invest in. Right? I'll give you an example. So, I just read sa GMA News and I just posted it on my Facebook. 80+% of world abaca exports, world abaca supply come from the Philippines. But we only make 10% of the profits out of abaca because we only export the raw material. So, kung magtataya ang state through industrial policy, meaning parang it will help the private sector, or it may come in itself and build abaca processing centers. That's one example, right? Or for example, yung isang example from Stevie Cunha, yung sabi niya, like nickel, we export a lot of nickel, but we don't process it. So sabi ni Stevie, like, the government can step in and just say, you can't export nickel until you've processed it. Yung ganyang klaseng restrictions where the government steps in and tells the economy what it needs to do. And this is very different from the perspective, I think, of neoclassical economists who believe that the state shouldn't work that way. And we can have a debate or a kind of discussion about what is the role of the government in kind of economic policy.
Thank you, sir. And I think nakita rin natin sa ibang bansa and even our neighbors na effective yung ganong policy. For example, in Indonesia, the same argument about nickel, na hindi sila nag-release or nag-export ng raw nickel, kailangan sila mismo mag-process. And
Mm.
nakikita natin na mas parang naunahan na nila tayo in terms of GDP, in terms of our economic indicators. So, I think mas maganda po talaga i-explore natin yan as a country.
Yeah, yeah. And what I want to say about kind of manufacturing, kasi of course the argument is, don't we have a comparative advantage in services? Usually when economists say comparative advantage, they are mistaking description for prescription. What do I mean by that? We have when you say we have a comparative advantage in services, you are describing the way the economy is right now, meaning we are reliant on services. We are more advanced in terms of services relative to other countries. That's description, right? A prescription is to say that actually services, they may make you some money, but ultimately, how has every other country gotten rich, right? No country has really become super rich because of services. They've made things, right? So maybe you can get kind of rich through services, but you will never be the economic powerhouse that you can be. And do we really want Filipinos to just play second fiddle? We're just, playing the services game. Yung manufacturing, yung big manufacturing that really creates strong economies, hindi para sa atin yun. So what? Are we just resigning ourselves to being kulelat, right? That's very sad. And also, like, economics is actually moral philosophy. It's not about being a technician. It's about making moral choices. And I think industrial policy is a moral choice. Why? Because in order to participate in the services economy, you have to be educated already, right? You need to speak English, you need to be able to be in a call center. Whereas actually, manufacturing jobs, they're the great equalizer because I may not have an education, but I can operate a machine. And if I operate a machine, then that multiplies my productivity, right? And so it's a kind of great equalizer. And so more people can be included in the workforce if it's a manufacturing based society. And these people, when they enter manufacturing jobs, another thing is that they are more likely to unionize because there's no unionization in the service sector. So maybe you can make jobs in the service sector, but I think a fairer society anchors itself on a kind of manufacturing, on a kind of manufacturing economy. That is a moral position. That's not a technical position. That's a moral position.
Thank you, sir. And then siguro with the last topic na po natin, no? What advice can you give to us young liberals? What economic or political ideas should be prioritized to shape our country's future?
So ako, lagi ko sinasabi, yung dalawang S ko na lagi ko tinutulak, sagana and serbisyo. So, pasok na tayo dito sa political communication. Hindi ako eksperto dito, pero ang sa tingin ko, anti-corruption no longer works. I know that the Liberal Party, its last big win was of course 2010 on an anti-corruption platform. But only one president has really won on an anti-corruption platform. It's Noynoy. So we're not sure if we can replicate that. When we tried to replicate that through the Leni Robredo campaign, hindi na gumana, di ba? So dapat na mapagtanto natin na, okay, maybe kumita na yung anti-corruption, we should pivot. And if you look at surveys, because we are a poor country, what people want is they want services and they want to get richer. And I think once people get richer, that's when they start participating in anti-corruption campaigns. Because, you know, you tell the poor Filipino, sumali ka sa anti-corruption campaign namin, sasali ba siya sa'yo kung yung basic needs niya are not fulfilled yet? So you fulfill their basic needs and then they become part of your anti-corruption campaign. So ako, recently, along with my friend Richard Darren, you know, we've been flipping the script of yung famous LP taglines. Sinasabi namin, kung mabawasan ang kahirapan, it doesn't sound as good as the original, mababawasan ang korap. Kung ang gobyerno kung umangat ang buhay ng lahat, ang gobyerno ay mas magiging tapat. Doesn't sound as nice, but I think it's more empirically true than the original taglines.
Thank you very much po, sir. I think that concludes our discussion. Maraming salamat po for those insightful ideas and insightful na napag-usapan po natin. And we will sure sana yung mga listeners po natin would take some new insights about liberalism, about industrial policy, and of course about our political future in our country. So maraming salamat po, Professor
Maraming
Leloy.
salamat, Addie. Maraming salamat sa Liberal Youth.
Para sa bawat kabataan. Ituloy natin ang kwentuhan sa comment section o sa lahat ng ating social media accounts at Liberal Youth PH gamit ang hashtag na hashtag The Freedom Show. Hanggang sa susunod, ako po ulit si Addie Demafeliz mula sa Liberal Youth para sa The Freedom Show.